Well, hey, thanks very much for having me. I should point out that one of the rules in academics is the smarter you are, the less you have to dress up, which explains why no tie for Vivek. But I'm going to do my best nonetheless. Now, in some ways, what we're debating is not so much destinations as directions. The country stands at a crossroads. It happened that I worked as a consultant in the 1989 presidential election in Chile, and that was the first election that had happened since the CIA-assisted coup in 1973. And I remember in the discussions that I saw in 1989 in Chile thinking, I hope I never live in a country where elections are so important. Well, I have bad news. Many of us feel like the next election is going to change the world. And I do worry that whoever loses, and someone will, whatever side loses, is going to say, I don't accept this outcome. So I worry that this debate over direction is one that we have to try to take seriously and articulate exactly what we mean by our terms rather than approach it in a way that demagogues. I want to compliment Professor Chibber for having done a very good job of being clear. We often debate, although he did not, as if two ideals, market systems and communism, were possible. Let me say that many people on my side seem to have a little shrine of markets that they worship. If you ask them for an example, well, what country do you have in mind? What actual country on earth do you have in mind? That's what would happen. It would happen if we just had markets. And there are people on the left that make the same mistake. If a social system is not feasible at scale, then it cannot be desirable. The idea that we should embrace socialism in the sense of being a Soviet-style, fully planned economy is nonsense. You can't embrace a ghost, and we don't want to embrace a zombie. The question that's posed here, though, is should we embrace socialism more as a direction? That's only interesting if socialism means things we're not already doing that we have not already embraced. Now, those would include, as Professor Chibber said, state ownership and direction of the means of production of a substantial part, in fact, more than half of GDP, and state control of direction of an entire menu of prices, including wages, interest rates, and commodities, so as to ensure that prices conform with democratic and not economic goals. Problem is that there's also no examples of countries that work along those lines. Angola, Cuba, Mozambique, North Korea have such grotesque limits on political freedom and such stunted levels of prosperity, they're not worth considering. If by capitalism you mean the uncontrolled working of prices through markets, then we also don't find any examples of that we want to pursue. So the point is not whether socialism or capitalism actually exists. Neither of those can be embraced. All existing systems are mixed. What sort of existing system might we try to redirect our own system towards? Now, capitalism uses market prices to direct production. The value of resources and assets and profits are used to determine the distribution. So capitalism is a system of production and distribution. Democratic socialism uses votes and bureaucracy to direct production and subsidies and transfers to determine distribution. Those are the choices that are before us. The key reason that socialism is unworkable is that it lacks any kind of price mechanism for signaling the value and opportunity cost of resources. So a system that relies on the price mechanism can't be socialism. And a system that is socialism can't rely on the price mechanism. So the failure to control market forces, including the tendency towards cronyism that we see in the United States, are just as big a distortion of prices. It doesn't matter if some bureaucrat who's educated on the left or if some corporate CEO who recognizes the interests of the right is the one doing the planning, that is the one who is distorting the price system. The effects are just as pernicious. So I expect we agree about that sort of price manipulation is the big danger that we see coming from the right and from cronyism. So here's the thing that I want to propose, and I'm from North Carolina. Every October we have a state fair, and at the state fair we have the beautiful pig contest. Now these are always young pigs. But imagine that we were to have a beautiful pig contest for adult pigs. Now, we bring out the first of two contestants. There's only two because there's not many pretty pigs. We bring out the first pig and we look at it. Oh, that's a really ugly pig. Let's just give prize to the second pig. Well, that's what people on both sides tend to do. They look at the problems with markets and say, therefore, the state should do it. Well, wait. You're comparing the state you can imagine with markets that actually exist. And Lord knows people on the right do this. They point out problems with the state, and then they compare it to the markets that they can imagine. So the question is to delineate the set of activities that we would like to try to use markets and the set of activities that we would want to use the state. So what is the argument for capitalism, now that we recognize we're comparing two ugly pigs? It's actually simple. Wealth and prosperity is the result of division of labor or specialization that's directed by the price system. Now, division of labor does not require a market system, but division of labor and market systems work well together in a decentralized setting. So we're used to the sort of specialization that was present at the origins of this. If your last name is Cooper, you come from a family that used to make barrels. If you come from a family named Smith, then they made metal products. If you come from a family of bakers, then they made bread. So we're used to this idea of specialization. What happens with specialization is that people develop skills and they become more productive. They also are able to take pride in their work because they have some connection to this profession. The result of that is, if I specialize and you specialize, we're creating a system of cooperative mutual exchange, where I depend on you. If I'm the baker, I depend on you to be the smith. We can't live without each other. The question is how best to organize that kind of cooperation. The Industrial Revolution was the beginning of the serious application of market organization to the division of labor. And Adam Smith's famous example was the pin factory. And what he pointed out was that if you divide workers from the artisanal making of pins into many little separate steps, you could make hundreds or thousands of times as many pins. And the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, which means that markets want to be global. The advantage of markets is that they increase the breadth and quality of consumer products and they reduce the price. What markets also do, though, is destroy jobs. Throughout history, what markets have done is destroy jobs because increases in efficiency are going to drive out other companies or other workers who are less efficient. Now, that seems, and it is in fact, destructive. Even proponents of markets call it creative destruction, in fact. The advantage of it was pointed out by Adam Smith as early as 1776 in his example of the woolen coat. In Smith's example of the woolen coat, he noted that people were able to get winter coats that were of a higher quality that would have been available even to royalty just 100 years earlier, because the quantity and price, quantity went up, quality went up, prices went down, everybody could get woolen coats. Downside was that many people who used to make coats that weren't very good no longer had jobs. So there was a big increase in the amount and quality of stuff at lower price that consumers got to have. That meant a substantial reduction in poverty. What capitalism is really good at is reducing poverty, but there was a price to pay, and it was inequality. There's two really different problems that are often conflated, and I want to try to distinguish them here. One is poverty, and the other is inequality. They're not the same thing, and there's often a trade-off between them. The way to end poverty is to enable the poor to enrich themselves, so there are no poor. The end to inequality is to destroy wealth, so there are no rich people. If your primary concern is about inequality, then the goal is to destroy. If your primary goal is to solve the problem of poverty, your primary goal is to create. It's tempting to think, why not both? The problem is that doing both at the same time is not easy. Since the pro-market reforms of Deng Xiaoping in 1978, China has seen two enormous changes. First, the largest decline in poverty in history, the largest decline in human poverty in history. More than 500 people, by market reforms, were lifted out of extreme poverty as China's poverty rate fell from 88% in 1981 to 6.5% in 2012. 88% poverty in 1981, 6.5% poverty in 2012. Now, that's using poverty in a way that's comparable, the equivalent of US $2 less or per day. What went along with that decline in poverty? The biggest increase in inequality that the world has ever seen. China has by far the most unequal political system in the world. If you ask poor people in China who've seen a dramatic increase in their living standard, in many cases 1,000% or more in purchasing power parity terms, a lot of them are going to likely say that increased inequality was worth it because the reduction in poverty really improved their lives. Really, really poor people tend not to be so concerned about inequality. They're concerned about poverty. The question is, at what point are we not willing to accept the inequalities that are created by this system? Now, remember, by socialism, I mean a system that relies on state ownership or control of the means of production, the state direction of production decisions over a substantial, not all, but over a substantial part of the economy. Ownership solves a problem of the commons. Political incentives are often very short-run, and we often hear about the problems in markets that corporate CEOs have very short-run goals. Well, if you're in the US House of Representatives, how long are your goals? 2 years on November 9th. That's on November 9th. Political systems, likewise, have very short-term goals because they're focused on the next election. If you look at the pathologies of the US system, the failure to build infrastructure, the failure to address climate problems, maybe it's because it's controlled by the wealthy, but more likely it's the very short-run goals that elections induce in democracy. These are two ugly, ugly pigs. Let's make a comparison with Sweden. Now, I should point out that one of the things that these debates often look like is two amoebas trying to reach out a pseudopod and envelop Sweden. Because Sweden is the country that I would point to as being the best example of how capitalism can work. And if you look, in 1990 or so, Sweden had a very substantial proportion of its total GDP that was provided by state-owned enterprises. But their growth was low, and they decided that because of failing industries, a lot of labor market regulations that made firing difficult or impossible, huge increases in labor costs. Gunnar Myrdal, the Nobel Prize winner, famously asked whether Swedes had been turned into a nation of swindlers. Sweden's economy was doing very poorly. The situation of debt and stagnation was getting worse. They turned back towards capitalism. At present, Sweden is the 19th most capitalist country in the world. If we measure that based on property rights, trade openness, freedom to use stock to create new corporations, there are more billionaires per capita in Sweden than there are in the United States, by a lot. So by that measure, at least, inequality is very high in Sweden. But there's a lot less poverty. Sweden has a lot less poverty because they have used their capitalist system to create a surplus that allows them to redistribute, to take care of the problem of poverty. The price they have paid is inequality. But that's a price worth paying because the inequality created by capitalism allows us to solve the problem of poverty in a way that nothing else does. So it was capitalism that saved Sweden. Sweden was heading downward. They were having problems with economics. They moved back to the point where they're actually in the top 10 of many measures of capitalism. Sweden is, and if you talk to someone in Sweden, you talk to Swedish government officials, they'll say, I don't know what y'all are talking about. We are a market economy. The different systems that Sweden uses are, without exception, a market economy. Sweden has a 100% universal voucher system for education. So forget charter schools, it's a voucher system. It is purely privatized. That may be a bad idea, but that's Sweden. They have a purely privatized pension system. They went from defined benefit to defined contribution that's assigned to individuals. It's invested in one of 700 private index funds. As the Prime Minister of Norway, also supposedly a socialist nation, said, "The Nordic model is an expanded welfare state which uses capitalism to provide a high level of security for its citizens. But it's a successful market economy with much freedom to pursue your dreams and your lives as you wish." That was the Prime Minister of Denmark. So in terms of deregulation, business freedoms, Denmark, Finland, and Norway are 7th, 8th, and 9th most free. Sweden is 12th. The US is 15th. Those countries are the capitalist countries. If you want to embrace socialism and what you mean is capitalism, let's do that. But those are capitalist countries. If you want to move in the direction of the Northwest European states, you are saying that we should embrace capitalism. And the reason to do it is that we can use capitalism to create the surplus that will help us solve the problems of inequality. So I want to sum up, and if you only remember one thing from what I'm going to say today, it should be this. Every flaw in voters is worse in consumers. Forgive me. Every flaw in consumers is worse in voters. Every flaw in consumers is worse in voters. That is, there are people who are too stupid to be able to decide what size Coke to drink. If we gather them into a large unorganized mob, they can decide foreign policy. Because it's the same people. They don't have very good institutions to enable them to enact the sort of social movements that I agree completely with Professor Chirber is what we need. What we need to do is embrace democracy. We don't need to embrace socialism. What we need to do is embrace democracy. Now, that may just be sour grapes. I was a 2008 governor candidate for the Libertarian Party in North Carolina. I was included in 4 televised debates, but I found it very difficult to be allowed to participate in politics with the 2 state-sponsored parties who find competition very inconvenient. If we had a system that actually allowed competitive parties, if we had a system that allowed proportional representation, if we had a system that encouraged political competition, the problem is not the lack of economic competition, the problem is the lack of political competition. All we need to do is embrace democracy, and we'll be able to solve a great deal of this problem. And the other thing that I want to say is that we don't need to embrace socialism. Capitalism saved Sweden, and now Sweden can save capitalism. The Swedish model is the way to save capitalism. What we need to do is embrace democracy. Thanks for listening.